I buried my mother twice, and the second time, she was still breathing in my memories. If you're here for a clean-cut villain and a halo-wearing victim, click away now. This story is uglier than that. This is about a daughter who grew up learning that love could be weaponized, receipts could be burned, and silence could be sold as family loyalty. I'm telling this now because the first move has already been made, and once you hear how it started, you'll understand why there was never going to be forgiveness. Only patience. Growing up, my mother was the kind of woman people trusted instantly. PTA meetings, church potlucks, handwritten thank you cards. She smelled like lavender and lemon polish. She hugged you just a little too tight and told everyone she was doing her best as a single mom. At home, she kept a different ledger. I learned early that I was an investment. Not a child. Every piano lesson, every honor roll certificate, every smiling photo was something she could cash in later. You owe me, she'd say, half joking, half not, when I asked for anything. I gave up everything for you. That sentence followed me like a shadow. When I was 16, she took out credit cards in my name. I didn't find out until college applications got denied and a banker looked at me like I was already a criminal. When I confronted her, she cried. Full-body sobs. Told me she was desperate. Told me I'd understand when I was older. I did understand. Just not the way she hoped. The worst part wasn't the debt. It was the gaslighting. The rewriting of reality. She told relatives I was bad with money. She told friends I was unstable. When I stopped coming home as often, she told everyone I'd abandoned her. And they believed her. So I did what I'd always done, I stayed quiet. I paid the debt. I worked 2 jobs. I rebuilt my credit. I smiled in photos. I played the role of the difficult daughter who was working on herself. But here's the thing about being raised by someone like my mother, you learn to observe. You learn patterns. You learn that people who control narratives get sloppy when they think they've won. Years later, when she got sick, not dying, just sick enough to need help, she called me. Voice soft. Apologetic. Said she wanted to make things right. Said she'd changed. I went back. Her house was exactly the same. Same photos on the walls. Same trophies that were technically mine. Same locked drawer in her bedroom she'd told me never to open. That drawer was the first crack in everything. One night, while she slept, I opened it. Inside were documents. Old ones. Bank statements. Letters. A manila folder with my name on it, written in her handwriting, dated years before I was born. And at the bottom, something that made my hands shake so badly I had to sit on the floor to keep from screaming. It wasn't just identity theft. It was proof that my life, my name, my history, even my father, had been carefully edited long before I ever took my first breath. That was the moment I realized, I wasn't here to reconcile. I was here to finish what she started. I closed the drawer. Put everything back exactly how it was. Kissed her on the cheek the next morning. Made her tea. Told her I'd stay as long as she needed. And as she smiled at me, relieved, convinced she'd finally pulled me back into her orbit, I smiled too. Because now I knew the truth. And the truth meant she was already losing, she just didn't know how yet. The folder didn't leave my head. It sat there like a loaded gun. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in my childhood bed, staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars she'd glued to the ceiling decades ago, replaying every moment of my life with a new lens. Every lie. Every misunderstanding. Every time she'd looked me dead in the eyes and told me I was imagining things. Turns out, I wasn't imagining enough. The next morning, I became the perfect daughter. I cooked breakfast. I cleaned. I listened to her stories, the same recycled anecdotes where she was always the hero and I was always the problem child who meant well. I nodded at the right moments. Laughed softly. Took mental notes. That's when I noticed something important. My mother didn't fear losing me. She feared losing control of the story. Whenever I asked gentle questions, about my father, about old addresses, about why my birth certificate had always been misplaced, her eyes flicked away for half a second. She'd redirect. Deflect. Joke. Change the subject. Classic tells. She taught them to me. So I stopped asking out loud. Instead, I started digging. While she napped, I photographed documents with my phone. I copied account numbers. I emailed myself scans from her old desktop, the one she never password protected because she believed privacy was something other people needed. That's how I found the second ledger. Not financial. Emotional. Printed emails. Handwritten notes. Letters she'd never sent. Conversations with relatives where she carefully planted doubts about me years before I ever acted out. Plans to move money. Plans to move me, schools, cities, identities, like pieces on a board. And then there was the name. A different last name. Crossed out in pen. I finally understood why every time I asked about my father, she'd stiffen like I'd reached for a bruise. Why there were no photos. No stories. No grave. No explanation, just a vague, he left. He didn't leave. She erased him. And judging by the dates, she'd done it deliberately, legally, and with help. That's when the anger hit, not loud, not explosive, but cold and surgical. The kind that doesn't scream. The kind that waits. I realized something terrifying and empowering all at once. My mother had built her entire life on fraud, manipulation, and stolen identities, including mine. Which meant the same system she used to trap me could be turned against her. That night, I made my first move. I didn't confront her. I didn't cry. I filed a request. Just a simple one. Quiet. Official. The kind that sets wheels turning you can't stop once they start. When she asked me the next day what I'd been doing on my phone so much, I smiled and said, just catching up on things I should have looked into a long time ago. She laughed. Brushed it off. But her hands were shaking when she lifted her tea. And for the first time in my life, I saw it. Fear. Not of losing a daughter. But of someone finally reading the fine print she'd hidden for decades. The thing about fear is that once it shows itself, it never quite learns how to hide again. After that tea incident, my mother started watching me the way she used to watch cashiers ring up change, polite, smiling, but alert for mistakes. She asked where I was going. Who I was texting. Why I needed my birth certificate now. I gave her nothing. I'm just organizing my life, I said. You always told me to be responsible. She hated that. Because I was using her words without her permission. A week passed. Then another. That's when the letters started arriving. Official ones. Windowed envelopes. Not addressed to me, but to her. I never opened them. Didn't need to. I could tell by the way her face drained of color when she checked the mail. She stopped sleeping through the night. I could hear her pacing at 3 a.m., whispering on the phone to someone she called by first name only. Old accomplices. Old favors being called in. That told me two things. I wasn't wrong. I wasn't finished digging. So I escalated. I contacted a man I'd never been allowed to know. Not directly, not yet. I used intermediaries. Paper trails. The kind that can't be erased once they exist. And suddenly, the story of my life started changing shape. Dates didn't line up. Addresses overlapped. My mother's timeline had gaps big enough to hide entire people in. Including one man who'd been paying child support for years, to an account that didn't belong to me. She stole more than my identity. She stole my inheritance. That's when I understood the drawer. The ledgers. The careful filing. She hadn't just been surviving. She'd been planning. When I confronted her, not with accusations, but with curiosity, she snapped. "Why are you digging into things that don't concern you?" she hissed, the mask finally slipping. "You wouldn't even exist if it weren't for me." There it was. Not love. Ownership. I looked at her then, not as my mother, but as a woman who'd built a life by taking pieces from others and calling it sacrifice. "I'm just trying to understand who I am," I said quietly. She laughed. A sharp, ugly sound. "You are who I say you are." That was the moment I decided. I wasn't going to expose her publicly. I wasn't going to scream or sue or beg for justice. I was going to let her live inside the truth she'd buried, slowly, professionally, and with witnesses. That night, she locked her bedroom door for the first time since I'd been back. That night, I booked a one-way trip, not away from her, but toward the last piece of the puzzle. And the cruelest part? She helped pay for it. She still thought she was in control. She still thought I was her daughter. She had no idea I was about to introduce her to the person she worked hardest to erase. And once that happened, there would be no version of this story she could rewrite. I met him on a Tuesday. Ordinary day. Wrong universe. He was older than I expected. Not fragile, just worn in the way men get when life didn't turn out the way it was promised. Same eyes as mine. Same crease between the brows when concentrating. I noticed that first, before the shock could catch up. He didn't recognize me. Not at first. I introduced myself using the name my mother gave me. He flinched, just slightly. Like he'd heard it before in a dream he couldn't quite remember. We sat across from each other in a diner that smelled like burned coffee and regret. I told him I was researching family history. I said my mother's name. That's when his hand started shaking. "She told me you were gone," he said. "She said you weren't real anymore." Piece by piece, the truth spilled out. He hadn't abandoned us. He hadn't disappeared. He'd been erased. Court filings altered. Addresses changed. Letters intercepted. Money rerouted. He'd fought at first, lawyers, motions, appeals, until suddenly he was told there was no child to fight for anymore. No legal trace. Just like that, I'd been deleted. I walked back to my hotel afterward and threw up in the sink. Not because of him, but because of how clean she'd done it. How methodical. How permanent. When I got back to her house days later, she knew. She didn't ask where I'd been. She didn't yell. She just looked at me with a smile so tight it could have cut glass and said, "You spoke to him, didn't you?" I didn't deny it. That's when she finally stopped pretending. "You think he's going to save you?" she said softly. "Men like him always disappoint." "I protected you." Protected. That word. I laughed then. A real laugh. The kind that scares people. "I know everything," I said. "The accounts. The letters. The lies." Her face hardened. "You wouldn't dare." She still thought exposure was the weapon. She still didn't understand what I'd done. Because while she was panicking, calling lawyers, shredding papers, trying to stay ahead of consequences, I was already past that. I'd changed nothing publicly. No police. No lawsuits. No confrontations. Instead, I did something much worse. I rewrote the narrative legally. Power of attorney. Medical proxies. Beneficiary updates. All signed during moments she thought were reconciliation. Moments when she was tired. Moments when she trusted me. When she finally realized, really realized, what she'd signed, it was too late. She screamed. She cried. She called me ungrateful. And then she said the one thing she thought would end me. "You wouldn't exist without me." I leaned in close and whispered, "Neither will your version of this story." She's still alive. But the woman who controlled everything, money, memory, identity. She's already gone. And what comes next? That's the part no one ever expects. Because revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it smiles. And sometimes, it lets the villain live long enough to understand exactly what they lost. Here's the part everyone expects me to say I regret. I don't. By the time winter came, my mother was a ghost in her own house. Still breathing. Still talking. But powerless. Every bill rerouted. Every account frozen, for her protection. Every decision filtered through me, the dutiful daughter she'd trained so well. The neighbors praised me. Such a good girl. The irony tasted sweet. She tried everything in those last months. She cried about her health. She reminded me of sacrifices. She threatened to tell people I was abusive. But here's the thing about paperwork and witnesses and signatures. Once they're done correctly, emotion means nothing. Then came the night she finally broke. She was sitting at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug she didn't have the strength to lift anymore. She looked smaller than I remembered. Older. Afraid. I never meant to hurt you, she said. That was the closest thing to an apology she'd ever given. I nodded. Not because I forgave her, but because I finally understood her. She hadn't destroyed my life out of hatred. She did it out of fear. Fear of abandonment. Fear of losing control. Fear that if anyone else mattered more than her, she'd disappear. And that's when the ending changed. I didn't finish her. I restored what she erased. I corrected records. I reunited bloodlines. I made sure the truth existed, even if it was quiet. Even if it didn't trend. Even if no one clapped. And then I walked away. I moved cities. Took my real name. Built a life that didn't include her shadow. She's still alive, last I heard. Living in a care facility. Tells anyone who will listen that her daughter betrayed her. That she doesn't understand why. And maybe that's the cruelest part. She controlled my story my entire life. Now she gets to live in one where she's the victim, and no one is listening. As for me, I didn't destroy my mother. I outgrew her. And if you're wondering whether revenge is worth it, ask yourself this. What's more brutal, ending someone's life? Or taking away their power and letting them live long enough to feel it?